Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking to Jennifer Warren about the realities of motherhood and parenthood in general in the legal profession. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today, we're excited to welcome Jennifer Warren back to the podcast. Jennifer is the Academic Achievement Coordinator at Oklahoma City University School of Law. You may have also come across her writing at the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the Girls Guide to Law School. In addition to her career accomplishments, Jennifer's also a mom and recently welcomed her second child, as I did. We were just chatting about that before we joined the podcast today, that we seem to be living parallel lives. And when we were both pregnant, I think was the last time we did a podcast together. And we talked about how we needed to have more frank discussions about motherhood in the legal profession. And so now that we have a couple more kids, a few months later, here we are. Which is kind of weird to think about it, that our kids weren't here when we last were on the phone together. Yeah. So one of the things that was interesting about pulling this podcast together is that I put out a call on one of my online mom groups, which I think online mom groups are one of the best things that have happened to professional moms because you don't have to go somewhere to hang out with other moms. And there's one that's just for lawyer moms. And I put out a call asking for what people thought we should talk about. And what was fascinating was the breadth of responses was so impressive and broad and deep that we're now going to do a series of podcasts on parenthood in the legal profession and things that come up for women in the legal profession. So stay tuned for that, because I think there was more than we could talk about in this one episode, which I guess shouldn't be surprising, but it was a little surprising to me how much people had to say. So Jennifer, thanks for joining us. And should we get started why don't I let you share a little bit about your journey to motherhood, and then I'll share a bit more about mine.
Sure. So I had my son, my first child, about 3.5 years ago. And then I just recently welcomed my daughter, and she's now 5 months old. So when I had both my children, I was working for sort of big institutions, right? For one, I was in-house working for a municipality, and for my daughter, I'm at a university. So I've kind of navigated the world of paid leave and FMLA and that sort of thing with children. And for me, having children wasn't something I was ever really sure that I would do, but I'm definitely glad that I've done it. And what I'll say about it is that being a parent and having children, it impacts sort of every decision and every choice you make. And when people tell you, you don't really know what it's like until you actually have children, it's true.
Yeah, that is so true. I think that is part of it. You can only prepare so much because every kid is different. Every life is different. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and we didn't realize that our stories were quite so parallel, because I also didn't know that I was necessarily going to become a mom. And so I too have 2 kids. My oldest is a preschooler, and he is about 4, or a little over 4, I guess, marching towards 4.5. He's definitely 4.25, as he told me the other day. So he is on his way to 4.5. And I have a 4-month-old little girl. And I chose to have my kids in my late to mid 30s, but I'm not going to out exactly how old I am on the podcast. People can probably figure that out from my LinkedIn profile if they want to. And I was self-employed, and when I had both kiddos, I also have been married to my husband for now quite a long time, and I had planned both pregnancies. So I did want and was looking forward to having both kids. So my experience with managing work and a pregnancy are a little bit different because I didn't work for big institutions. I was working for my own institution, which is a different challenge. I also lived through a pregnancy loss while trying to conceive my daughter in 2017. And I think that's important to talk about because when you're thinking about motherhood and work in the legal profession, pregnancy loss, which is something that most people go through, or a lot of people go through, can be one of the things that you have to live through and navigate. And I think we don't talk about it enough. And I think as a community of women especially, we can support each other and help each other through that time. So yeah, didn't know I was going to become a mom, but I'm glad I did. It's definitely the most challenging thing I've ever done. It pushes me every day. I can survive on less sleep than I ever thought possible. And, there are days where you're like, I cannot believe I'm doing this. There are days where I've told my husband, like, I wish I wasn't the adult in the room. So this was all my responsibility. But then my kids giggle or we snuggle up together or now watching my kids be siblings together. I'm really thankful that I did make this choice to start this family. And I too, I couldn't imagine what my life would be like without it. I kind of wonder what I did with all my free time now that I have two kids.
What did we do with all our free time?
I don't know.
I'm so much more productive and efficient now that I'm a mom because you have to be.
Yeah. And I thought I was busy, which now is comical to me.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, you and I kind of talked a little bit before this podcast about what we wanted to talk about. And then I polled the law mamas and they gave me some suggestions. So I thought maybe the way that we could start this discussion was really, if you are, not necessarily ready to start motherhood, but how do people figure out when they want to have a kid? So I definitely don't have an answer to this. I don't know, but what do you think?
I think it's actually the first of many things that you can't actually plan when you have children. Yeah. Right. You can try to have this plan, but when it comes to children, you're probably at some point going to have to just push it all to the wayside and just sort of go with the flow.
Yeah.
So you can think about it and you can, make a plan as much as you can, but you also have to prepare yourself that things may not work out the way you anticipate them working out.
Yeah. I think that's very true. I think, there's that idea that you can decide you're maybe ready to start trying to get pregnant. Maybe you're in a stable job situation. You and your partner, if you have a partner, feel like that you can, financially manage the situation. Maybe you accidentally get pregnant. That's a whole different situation. But if you're trying to plan this, I think you can plan to start the process. But then for us type A women, I think it can be very hard to accept that you cannot necessarily control getting pregnant. It can take a month. It can take 5 years. You can end up adopting and have it happen in a couple of weeks. That happened to my friends that they had kind of been on this long journey of trying to conceive. And then they get a phone call that someone, would like to offer their baby up for adoption to them. And then within 2 weeks, they're home with a brand new baby, which I think would make my head completely want to explode. But so lots of things can happen. And, you can do IVF, which can take a lot of extra time and money. From a professional perspective, it can take a lot of time away from the office. I think it's really challenging. I think one of the other things people talk about a lot these days in lawyer circles, especially, is about freezing your eggs. Which is very common out here in the Bay Area, partly because we have some of the first egg freezing medical doctors. I think it was developed out here. But, it's not like that's an easy solution either. I don't know, Jennifer, have you had anyone in your circle do it?
Well, it's just, I think when you're going through IVF or you're considering freezing your eggs, you have to be aware that that's not necessarily something that's going to be successful for you, right? So it's not something I think you should count on or rely on in terms of, planning your journey into parenthood.
And it's not easy. I mean, this stuff is a process in and of itself. We're definitely not doctors, but there are lots of hormones. There are lots of doctor's appointments. The procedure to retrieve eggs requires you to go under general anesthesia. it's not like you can just say, oh, it's like going to the dentist. Like I'll pop in and get my eggs frozen. Like it's not, it's not necessarily like that. And even, one of the things that happened in the Bay Area, and I think it happened in Cleveland as well. I think it was about a year and change ago. Some of the freezers at some of these fertility clinics failed and people lost embryos and frozen eggs. And, that just showed again you would love to hope that wouldn't happen, but none of this stuff is guaranteed because life is uncertain. And all I can hope is that now that has happened almost simultaneously, these two facilities, that their backup procedures are even better than they used to be. But it just showed how imperfect some of this stuff is. And so you can't necessarily say, hey, I'm going to freeze my eggs and we're going to be good to go and I don't have to worry about this anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you have to also be aware too that like everybody's journey to parenthood is going to be different, right? So just because, your friend or your sister had this easy route to becoming a mother, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that way for you, right? So everybody's journey to get there is going to be different. It's going to be your own experience and, plan to the extent you can, but a lot of it's going to be out of your control.
Yeah. I think if you're starting to think about having a family, one of the things you can do is think a little bit about what your job will be like, and how being pregnant and taking maternity leave and going back to work may look. And that may be having some, conversations with mentors or folks who have had children and taken time off at your job and seen what their experiences have been like, and start just kind of learning about what that means. Because you might not be clear on how much time your current job will allow you to take for maternity leave, how disability in your state works and how that's going to work with your job. If you want to return to work full time, how that typically happens. Is part-time even an option? Some companies are now allowing women to kind of ramp back up a little bit. And so there are these new programs to help women kind of start part-time and build back in time. But I also think you should find out if your work is supportive of moms, because I just don't think that's the case everywhere.
Yeah, I think you really need to investigate that. And then you need to think, is now the time to stay in my current job? Do I need to switch jobs? And just sort of think long term about what's going to be best for your family, kind of given the situation at your office.
Yeah, I totally agree. So a lot of things to consider even before you are actually, necessarily trying to get pregnant. So let's say that after all of this, in whatever way it happens, that you do get pregnant. Yay, you're pregnant. Now what? So I think the first challenge is you have to figure out how to balance life responsibilities with the fatigue and physical strain of being pregnant. I mean, this is different for everybody. I didn't have terrible morning sickness, but I definitely had a lot more fatigue with my second pregnancy, probably because I had a toddler at home. But I've had friends who've gotten gravely ill and can barely function when they're pregnant.
Yeah, I hesitate to say this because people will probably hate me, but I loved being pregnant and I never felt better when I was pregnant.
I won't hate you.
I've had many friends. I've had many friends who dealt with these, serious side effects from being pregnant. So you have to figure out, how are you going to deal with that and take care of yourself and your baby, but how are you still going to, perform at work and do your job and get everything that you need to do done?
Yeah. I mean, it can be a real challenge, especially if you're trying to hide the fact that you're pregnant. And if you are very sick, it can make it even more difficult to hide. If you look very fatigued, if you are, I've had friends who've had not only morning sickness, but just sickness, like through the day. I luckily didn't suffer from that. I would just get tired. But, I think it can be difficult to negotiate all of that, including, doctor's appointments, which can be, every month or so in the beginning of your pregnancy. But depending on how you're doing, sometimes you have to go to extra ultrasound appointments. And so you need to figure out how that's going to happen. Usually those have to happen during the workday, unfortunately.
And I really think that sort of your pregnancy and how your office responds to some of the time off you may need during your pregnancy is a good preview of what it's going to be like when you have your child, because there's going to be days that you have to take off for your kids' doctor's appointments or to take care of them because they're sick or things just come up during the day. You can kind of learn to manage that a little bit during your pregnancy. It's a good indication that you can manage it when your child is actually born.
I think that's a really good way to kind of test the waters a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, often at larger firms or in organizations where you don't necessarily think people will be as supportive, women will choose to hide their pregnancies as long as they can. For a number of reasons. I think a lot of people want to hide their pregnancy for that first trimester just because you don't know of the likelihood of the success of the pregnancy. If you're one of those people who worries about a pregnancy loss, there's this website that you can go to. I don't know if you ever saw this, Jennifer, where it gives you the every day of your pregnancy, what the percentage of the success of the pregnancy is. And so
oh, wow.
But it's funny. They'll either tell you the percentage likelihood of a loss or percentage of success. So I always chose to click on the let's be the positive one,
Yes.
But it's like every week and days you get further down, the chance of something going wrong diminishes. For those people who really want to be like a little cuckoo about it, in a loving sort of way. But I think a lot of people don't want to share that information because if the pregnancy isn't successful, they don't want to have to deal with that, ramification at work. But most of my friends who were in a work environment, a more institutional work environment, hid their pregnancies as long as they could until they were showing and they kind of couldn't hide it anymore.
Yeah, I think that's probably the more common route. That's what I did, to the extent that I could. I kind of waited as long as I could.
Yeah.
And you're not under an obligation to tell your employer that you're pregnant, early on or anything like that. So I think it's really just whatever you feel most comfortable with is the right decision.
Yeah. It can be hard though. I mean, I once found a friend sleeping at her desk in her office because she was newly pregnant. And I kind of walked in, shut the door and was like, you okay? It's not usually something you see in a law office.
And so, and I mean, for that reason, that might be a reason why you need to tell, your employer early on, because you want to explain, some of these symptoms or these absences. You don't want people to just think that you're slacking off for no reason or something like that.
Yeah. Or if you can just tell even a few people who can kind of help, I don't know, protect you, like create a little cocoon around you if you need a little bit more time, to just kind of help navigate or decide what your story is going to be if you don't want to share it, so you can, manage it best you could. So if you have like an assistant, you may want to be honest with your assistant because she or he is likely going to be able to help manage that situation for you, or maybe a mentor, a couple of your friends that you feel like you can trust. But probably going it alone without telling anyone might be practically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that happens is once you're pregnant, once people know you're pregnant, people will say all sorts of weird, unfortunate, and insensitive things. Some of them even ridiculous.
I saw this list that you sent, and I just could not believe that some people would say these things.
Yeah. So I have not heard all of these things, but these were some that were shared from our Lawyer Mom Facebook group. But I did have a couple of interesting comments made to me. So one of them was that, how did you get pregnant? Which is always interesting. It's like, you don't need to share that information. That's totally inappropriate. People asking, is this the first time you've been pregnant? What does your husband think about you working? Or it's nice that your husband lets you travel for work.
Wow.
Don't you think it's time that you stopped working so you can raise your kids? I mean, I think people will say all sorts of interesting things. I know when I was pregnant, I did have men share with me their opinions on labor and delivery, which was interesting. I think one man told me I was going to push a watermelon through my vagina and how I felt about that. And I was like, he was sharing his wife's birth story with me. And I'm like, I don't really, this was at like a professional conference. Like, I don't really need to have this conversation with you. Like, this is kind of between me, my husband, my midwife, like not like, I don't know. So,
it's funny how like when you're pregnant, sometimes people think that like personal like boundaries just sort of break down and they feel like they can just ask you anything. But
or the touching, people want to touch your belly. Lots like just people in the world will ask you all sorts of questions. I also love the like, oh, are you having a boy? No, I'm having a girl. Oh, you look like you're having a boy. Well, I'm pretty sure I'm having a girl. Are you sure? Oh, I'm pretty sure we did a DNA test. I'm pretty sure. There's like, because you look like you're, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I did the DNA testing and that's how we're going to roll with what's in the DNA. It's just, It is very interesting how once you are, I felt that there was such an interesting shift when you became so visibly pregnant, that it became this public thing that people could have opinions about, because most of things in my private life, like right now, like unless I have like spit up or something on me, like you don't know that I'm a mom unless I'm with my kids. But when you're pregnant, all of a sudden it's like public knowledge that you're carrying this person and that you're going through this thing in your life that people, I think, feel like that's inviting commentary.
Well, and people just have really strong opinions about pregnancy and children and how to raise children. And many of them just feel free to share those with you, even though you may not care for their opinions. So you just kind of have to be prepared for it. Yeah.
And, another story that a friend shared with me that I thought was something I hadn't really considered is once you are visibly pregnant, sometimes at work, other women who may also be pregnant or have kids want to bond with you over this. But it might not be a healthy bonding relationship. So, this friend had kind of a bit of a traumatic birth experience with her first and wanted to, is really working hard to protect herself from hearing negative birth stories, getting ready for her second, which I think is really healthy to do. And I think a lot of first time moms might feel this way too. Like, if you had a traumatic birth story, I don't really want to hear it because that will make me more scared. And that's not serving me. And then it can be hard because how do you tell someone at work, I don't want to talk to you about my pregnancy? Even though we're friends, but it can be hard to set those boundaries because on one hand, you're in a workplace and you feel like you should be able to set those boundaries, but you can have friendships too. And it can be very complicated. And you have to, hard.
Most people mean well, right? When they're sharing these things, they mean well. So that's, I think, what makes it so difficult.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, it definitely is kind of like the, people mean well, they want to help, but sometimes that's not always what you need. I also had the interesting distinction of the fact that I had a home birth and had a planned home birth for both my kids. And let's talk about the crazy things people would say to me about that. I heard it all. My favorite is always, you are so brave. Brave is the key word for crazy, by the way. Or, oh, well, let me tell you how I almost died in childbirth. And,
right.
So let me tell you why this is such a terrible idea for you. Or, who's this woman that you're having come over to like birth your kids? Like, it's not like this woman. It's like a licensed professional midwife, 2 of them actually, and a doula and an assist midwife and all these people. But it was very funny how my choice of deciding to have my kids at home seemed to also welcome all of this feedback on my choices, which I didn't particularly want, to be honest.
And you know what, though? It does not stop there, right? The choices you make with your children, like, are you going to nurse them? Are you going to give them formula? You know, what are you going to allow them to do as they get older? All of these things people have such strong opinions about. So I think you just have to start becoming comfortable that you are making the best choices for your family and just kind of tune out the criticism or anything else that other people have to say, because it does not stop just with pregnancy.
Oh, it's so right. If you choose to send them to a certain type of school, it's like, oh, well, why do you send them to that type of school? Why didn't you send them to another type of school? Why you have them in aftercare till 5:00? Like, when do you see your kids? You name it. Yeah. Everybody has an opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think you make a really good point that it's a really good test and learning experience of being confident in your own choices and being, realizing that you are in control of a certain number of things about how you handle your pregnancy, how you handle your babies and how you raise your babies. And, everybody else's opinion is just an opinion. Easier said than done.
Much easier said than done.
Yeah. All right. So what about planning for maternity leave? I know this is something you've written about on the Girls Guide to Law School. And I know have done this at a couple of institutions, I thought some of your considerations around maternity leave were really thoughtful.
There's so many things that you need to think about. The main thing that I would stress is just to try to prepare as much as you can, right? So treat yourself like you would treat a client, right? So if you are going to do this job for this client, you are going to research the issues thoroughly, and you're going to come up with like a detailed, specific plan, right? So you want to know, your benefits, what kind of protections you can have, just, the amount of leave you can get, whether it's paid, whether it's unpaid, all this sort of thing. And then also just planning for what it's going to be like when you're away from work for however much time you can take, right? And preparing your colleagues, preparing, your cases or your work. You just have so much that you have to think about.
Yeah, because there are financial considerations depending on how your work handles maternity leave. Like you said, paid and unpaid. Your individual role might have certain consequences to you being out of that role. And one of the things that's very popular out in the Bay Area, at least, I don't know if it's the same where you are, is that oftentimes parents will do their maternity leave one right after the other. So I have a lot of friends whose the father will do a paternity leave after the mom has gone back to work to extend the amount of time that one parent is at home with the kids. And that's an option that I think didn't used to be as popular, but is getting more and more popular.
Yeah. And, I do know some people in kind of my part of the country, kind of the middle America part of the country that I live in, that have been able to take advantage of that. But I don't think that it's widespread everywhere, right? So I know just for me personally, my husband was back working, 48 hours after both of our children were born. So I think it's a great option if you can take it. But if you don't have that option, right, if your spouse cannot take a parental leave, it probably means you just need to do a little bit more planning and be prepared for that.
Yeah. And, I like to think that this area is changing, that we're getting more progressive and dads are getting more and more opportunities. But it's oftentimes an institutional culture. I have a number of friends that work in tech, and tech is being better about this. And so, tech is like, you must take this paternity leave, but that's not how the rest of the world is necessarily. So I'd like to hope that we're getting to a point where men are feeling much more comfortable kind of claiming this time, because I think it's important for them too.
And I think some of those companies are at the forefront, and what they're doing is very slowly having an impact on other industries and in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
So we're not quite there yet, but we are slowly making progress.
Yeah. Well, I really like this idea that you mentioned about treating yourself kind of like a client, because it's always easier to solve other people's problems, much easier than it is to solve your own. I don't know if you feel the same way. But I think that there's a lot of research that needs to be done. Things like FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, how you're going to manage assignments. I think there can be a lot done to prepare for being gone. And you have to just kind of work with your employer as well.
And you need to take the responsibility for knowing what you're entitled to. Legally, under federal and state law, but also as a part of your employer's, HR policies. I wouldn't depend, on someone in HR or someone else to tell you what you're entitled to. You really need to do the research and give yourself the knowledge to make sure that you're getting everything that you're entitled to.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, my situation with maternity leave is a bit different because I, own this business with Alison, and the business has been in two very different places. When I've had my kids, we were much more, let's say, lean and mean when I had my first, and we're much more robust at this point, which made it a lot easier. But I think my experience of kind of sort of being on leave, but maybe needing to check in with the business is more along the lines of what often a lot of solo practitioners or small firm partners feel like they need to do, that totally stepping away from work for 6 weeks or 3 months or 6 months may not be completely possible. And so if you're in a role or you have a responsibility where you may not want or feel that it's possible to completely step away, you still want to investigate how to set some boundaries, because it is a beautiful and overwhelming experience being a mom, and you need to give yourself as much space as you can to do that. Now, we should probably say how angry it makes me that federally, we do not have these protections for moms yet. And I have friends who've worked for the federal government who had to piece together vacation days, and people were like gifting them paid time off so they could take maternity leave. And that just breaks my heart.
Right. Or, I know women who just really can't take any maternity leave hardly at all, maybe a couple of weeks and they have to be back at work because people, can't afford to take leave that's not paid.
Yeah. So, we have that's probably its own podcast, is the larger problems around how we treat new moms in our culture and what protections they need. But that's just more reason why, as part of this, if you are planning a pregnancy, part of this thoughtful process should be investigating what your options are. So at least you understand what you're getting into, and make sure that, that's okay with you.
And part of it is treating yourself well and giving yourself the space and time to enjoy the birth of your child in those first few weeks. But another part of it is also being a good employee, right? Yeah. You want to give your employer, notice and a plan to deal with your absence. And you want to be respectful to your colleagues who may have to pick up some assignments while you're on leave. So it's really a lot to balance. But I think it's important to come up with a good plan, not just for yourself, but for your employer as well. And, another thing to think about too is, especially if you're practicing or if you're doing litigation, is, what kind of deadlines might you have coming in the future? I remember when I was pregnant with my son, going to scheduling conferences and needing to ask for longer deadlines because I couldn't have a deadline falling, while I was out on maternity leave. So there's lots of things that you need to consider. And it's important to kind of start that planning process as early as you can.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And even I know for myself and also some of my friends with solos, if you're a solo, you really have to be aware of that too, because you've got to give those clients to someone else, and be thoughtful about new work that you take on and things like that. Have, maybe an assistant or a paralegal or somebody be babysitting some of these processes, calling them in if necessary. But for me, I just looked ahead and was like, well, what can I knock out? So one of the things we knocked out was we had, we run these 2 podcasts, and I had the podcasts recorded all through, the summertime. I had my son or my daughter over the summer, way into multiple months, because I could do that and knock that off the list, and that was something I had to schedule and come to my office to do and things like that. And so it was that was a big one where I had a huge plan to get all this stuff done. And Alison and I, did the whole plan. So we would be able to keep the machine rolling while I needed to step away. So there is, a lot you can do to be thoughtful and plan ahead and not even make it so aware to clients or people who are depending on you that you are stepping back.
Yeah, I agree. The more you can do ahead of time, the easier it's going to be while you're on leave and when you transition back to work.
Yeah. All right. So let's say you have your babies, you have hopefully beautiful births, everybody's healthy, everybody's happy. Then you got to go back and be a new mom at the office, which is not the easiest thing to do. I think there are a lot of mixed emotions with going back to work. What do you think?
Completely agree. I so distinctly remember my first day back at work after I had my son. And, I left him at a daycare all day. And I just felt, on the one hand, so scared and so guilty about leaving him. And then on the other hand, so relieved to sort of, be back in this environment where I was with other adults. And, I had some of this time to myself. So, yeah, the mixed emotions are definitely there. And I really don't think they go away.
No, because I just did a happy dance in the street with my friend as we dropped our kids off after the long holiday. And we were like, oh, because the kids had a whole week off for Thanksgiving. And we were like, oh, everybody's back. Our childcare's back. And, and our kids are off at school and we can go be grown-ups, And that's not to say that I didn't cherish my vacation with my family. We had a really nice time, but it's a lot, and I like my professional self and the hours I get to be my professional self. And we were literally adult grown women doing a happy dance in the middle of the street in San Francisco. So if you drove by and saw us, that's what that was about. I think it's always going to be this mixed bag. Even for my friends who are stay-at-home full-time moms, it's a mixed bag. They love to be with their kids, but they also feel that they need time away, because mothering and parenting is hard. It is hard. And
it's just sort of unforgiving, right? It
yeah.
never stops. It never ends. It's always taking something from you, and you get so much back from your children.
Yeah.
But it is hard.
It is. And you don't get to just like check out. I think I mentioned earlier in the podcast that there are moments when like I'll decide, I wish I wasn't the adult in the room, but there are times when I'm like, I wish I was not in charge of the situation. I wish I was not the person who has to problem solve, or that making these kids stop crying, making these choices, doing whatever was my responsibility. But it is. And you don't get to opt out.
It's all your responsibility. Like, these other humans are your responsibility. And it's sort of overwhelming at times.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think one of the other things that is very different about heading back to work is your routines are going to be totally different. I was trying to get out the door this morning. I was telling you when we were chatting right before the podcast started. So I was heading to the office, and I'm a pumping mom, so I had to make sure that like my bag had all of my pumping stuff. And then it was raining, so I had to get my kids' rain gear together. And then I was going to something else. And so we were taking an Uber, so I had to get the foldable car seat. And then I get us all in the car, and I forgot the backpack. So I had to come back to the house and get the backpack for my son to go to school. And it was like, then I had a work call. And I mean, my routines, and my daughter's 4 months and change now, I cannot seem to get a solid morning routine because every day is something different.
Yeah. Or like just when you're about to get out the door, the baby will, spit up on themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Or there's always something that's happening to throw you off.
Oh, for sure. I mean, the nicer of an outfit, like today I'm in yoga clothes. And so of course I have no spit up or anything on me, but if I had on a dry clean only top, I can guarantee you when I hug and kiss the baby that there would be puke coming down my shoulder.
Yeah.
It's like they know. They're like, that must be dry clean only.
Their timing is impeccable. It's like they just know when to spit up on you or when to get sick, like at the worst possible moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the routines are going to be hard. Everything's going to take a lot longer. And I think that, that just getting out of the house can be taxing in a way that it hasn't been before. And you are responsible, even if you have, depending on your childcare situation, you're still responsible for what happens in those childcare situations. That can be food or milk or formula or, lots of other pieces of the puzzle. And those are things that you have to handle as well. Even if you share it with your partner, your morning routines are still going to be a bit of a mess or a challenge.
Even though they'll be challenging, I do feel though, like as time goes on, you'll kind of get into your groove, right?
Yes.
I see some moms out there, and I feel like they had children and they just transitioned to motherhood so beautifully.
Yeah.
But that wasn't me at all. Like, I was just a total hot mess for a long time. But eventually I found my groove, right? So, you will find your new routine, and you will work it out, and you will find a way to get out the door most days successfully, right? Just give yourself time and kind of be kind to yourself as you're figuring this out.
Yes. And as my son's preschool teacher reminded me this morning, all things with children are temporary. She's like, it's not necessarily the phase will be over soon, but everything is a phase and it will change. So also, just when you think you've got it all figured out, then your child's needs change.
Right.
So that can be tricky. Going back to the office, there can be a lot of complicated things happening at work. You may or may not, those who are listening, have read about some of the legal suits that have been filed recently around women and pregnancy and returning to work in some of the larger law firms, that maybe some of those law firms were not making good choices, to speak like a mom of a toddler. They were making bad choices about how to handle women, and that's resulted in some pretty large class action lawsuits. I think, hopefully your firm is supportive and treating you in the fair and legal ways that they should when you return to work. But I think that that's not necessarily a given.
No, it's definitely not. And it's, obviously a problem in all industries, including the law. And I think it's great that some of this is coming to light in these lawsuits, because hopefully it's making women feel more comfortable speaking up about these issues if they think they're facing the same thing.
Yeah. I'd like to take a moment to talk about sleep deprivation as someone who hasn't gotten REM sleep in a few weeks. And, it's no joke, people. It's no joke. If you have one of those kids that sleeps through the night magically at 6 weeks, more power to you. I am so impressed. I would wish you'd sprinkle some of that special fairy dust on my house, because I do not have a household where children are great sleepers and sleep through the night without a lot of heavy lifting. Yeah. And it's hard when you don't sleep. It's really hard. Your brain doesn't function in the same way.
It doesn't function in the same way. And you just, I don't know, you have to find tricks to deal with it throughout the day.
Yeah. And you're likely to make mistakes. That's what's hard for me, is you're just not performing at the same level. Like you forget the backpack, which makes your whole morning spin out of control because I didn't sleep very much last night. Or you make a mistake at work. I was running payroll when I was very sleep deprived after my first son, and I accidentally paid someone a lot more than they meant to be paid. And I didn't catch it. Luckily, he was very honest, but I didn't catch it particularly fast. So, things happen. And I think there has to be a kindness, towards yourself about that sleep deprivation, and realizing that you can't control a lot of this. Our kids come out the way they come out. I have a dear friend who has twins. And when I was bemoaning the fact that I was very exhausted after my son was born, and she was like, listen, I hear you saying that you think you should be doing all these things, but I have 2 children who were grown in the same womb and fed the same food and slept in the same house and slept in the same room and had the same bedtime routines, and one sleeps and one doesn't. She's like, it's not your fault. There's nothing you can do about it.
It's not your fault. Right?
Yeah.
If you're hearing other moms or other parents talk about how great their children sleep, it's not your fault.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you have to just handle the situation that you're in, which is not easy. And you have to figure out how that's going to play into work. And I also think what's tricky is, and our kids are both, kind of going through this period of time now, our babies, there's something called the 4-month sleep regression, which for some people is no joke.
It's a real thing.
It's a real thing. It is a real thing, and it will bring you to your knees sometimes.
Yeah.
And that is around the time a lot of people go back to work.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really kind of cruel trick we play on women, is we tell them that at the end of this 4th trimester, which is oftentimes what people call the first 3 months, your baby's not an infant anymore. And so you should be good to go. And then they stop sleeping. And you're like, what happened? I thought I had it together. And I think there's a lot of kind of feelings of either shame, or that you're doing something wrong, or it's because you've gone back to work. But you can invest in a fabulous book called The Wonder Weeks, which will tell you it is not your fault, that it is a developmentally appropriate thing that happens during this time. But, this child's development is going to continue on in their own time schedule, no matter when you decide to go back to work.
And here are my sort of 2 thoughts on dealing with sleep deprivation. And the first, I would just say, don't hesitate to accept help. Like, hopefully you have, a supportive partner, and some of you can kind of tag team, right, some of the long nights so that you're each able to at least get some sleep, or accept help, from family or friends. Just do what you need to do to get sleep when you can get it. There's no shame in accepting help and kind of using your village to get through this period of time. And then my other super practical trick for dealing with sleep deprivation, when I'm at work and I've had a long night, I like to chew gum, right? So just you need to do something that's going to keep you awake and keep you focused. Mine is chewing gum. You have to find the trick that works for you.
Yeah. I will be honest, after the first kid, I didn't have any coffee for the first 8 months. And this kid, I was like, sorry, kiddo, mama's got to go back to the coffee. I won't have a lot.
Yeah.
I won't have a lot. I'll stay within the recommended, 1 cup a day or whatever. But this mama cannot do it without coffee. I just can't do it.
You just have to do what you can do, right?
Exactly.
And if that gets you through the day, that's fine.
Exactly. I think the other thing that can be kind of secretly challenging, that is not discussed as much as I would hope it would be discussed, is if you are choosing to be a nursing and pumping mama, and what the realities of that look like. And again, no judgment if you're feeding your kids breast milk or formula or a combination of both. I think fed babies are best babies. But if you do decide that you want to pump, that can become somewhat complicated at work. I have pumped for a long time. I pumped and nursed my son for 2.5 years, and now I'm pumping for my daughter right now. But it is a challenge because you actually are supposed to do it on a schedule to keep up your milk supply. So you have to think about how keeping up with that at your office is going to work. Most women want to pump in private. You may not have an office situation that is private. Now there are a lot of glass offices, so you might need to work with your job to find you a space that you're going to pump. You have to store the milk. You have to clean the pump parts. You have to remember the pump parts. It's a lot. And a lot of moms...
There's so many logistical details that you have to take into consideration.
Yeah, there really are. I mean, I personally am one of those people. I have a pump at the office. I have a pump at home. I also have a travel pump that's much smaller, but because I can't haul, they're also like terribly designed. If you've never seen a breast pump, I know that there are some new ones coming out that are supposed to be better, but I am constantly amazed at that this thing that is doing something that I don't feel like should be that complicated is a weird shape and has all of these plastic pieces that all have to be washed that are not easy to wash. They all have little holes and you have to scrub in the little things. And it is.
And they're all just loose and all over the place, and there's no good way to keep them organized.
No. And there's terrible. These tiny little... I'm a Spectrum mom now. I used to be a Medela mom. Also, there are all these brands, and you have to have all different pieces for all the brands. But there are these valves that are the keys to all these pumps working, these little tiny pieces that if you do not have this tiny, tiny piece, or if there's a hole in this tiny piece, the pump will literally stop working. And I remember that being that's little tiny thing is going to break the whole system. That's the key to the whole system, really. So there's got to be a better way, but it's a lot of work to keep that part organized. You have to store the milk. You got to travel with it. Sometimes when moms are traveling now, law firms will pay for things like a milk stork, which freeze dries your milk and ships it for you. If you fly with milk, if you fly for work, you get to learn about all TSA's special rules about ice packs. And I almost had a TSA agent give me the look like he was going to throw out my breast milk. And I was almost going to pull I'm a lawyer. You do not want to touch my breast milk. This is not going to go well for anyone. Trust me. Because there are rules around breast milk and TSA, and I have read them all.
Yeah, and you really just have to be prepared to sort of plan your day in a way to accommodate your pumping schedule, right? I remember when I came back with my daughter, I was teaching this class. It was taught in a 3-hour block of time, and I had to come up with this schedule where I would be able to pump at some point between this class and where are you going to take your break and how long is it going to take you? And there's just a lot that goes into it. So you just kind of have to be prepared for that.
And you kind of also have to have a bit of a, sense of humor about it. I have pumped in some really weird places over the years of my pumping life. And I have pumped at my college campus in a conference room where I overlooked this quad where I used to party when I was, probably underage. And I was just thinking about picking up my roommate who'd been throwing up in the plants outside this conference room, and I'm pumping breast milk for a baby. Now, it's just there are some weird things. I've pumped in cars and airports and offices and and bathrooms I wish I hadn't been pumping in, and airplanes. And I've done it in a lot of different places, and there are a lot of tricks to it. And this was an area where another Facebook group, again, I really don't love Facebook, but I really do love some of these Facebook groups for moms. There are nursing and pumping groups on Facebook that I joined that share a lot of hacks of how to make this as smooth as possible, or if you're in a work situation or a travel situation and you're not sure how to handle it, you can ask these moms. And oftentimes a lot of these moms have had a similar situation. And I learned a lot from this community of moms about how to manage doing a lot of pumping. And they probably kept me pumping because there were points when I wanted to give up, and they helped solve problems for me. So again, it's reaching out from help and learning from the mama community, because we've all learned a lot of lessons over the years that we can share with each other.
Yeah, nursing and pumping is hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not always this perfectly natural, easy process. It's hard. So if you want to, if you want to do it and it's important to you, I think getting support is really important in order to, give you everything that you need.
Yep.
But I'll say this also, I I did nurse my children, but at some point I did switch over and feed them formula, and that's perfectly okay too, right?
Yeah,
like if
exactly.
you choose not to nurse, if you choose not to pump, that's fine. Like, like you said, fed is best, and you're going to have healthy children no matter what you do. So I don't think people should feel any sort of guilt if they decide, or for whatever reason, they can't pump or they can't nurse.
For sure. And things happen. I have friends who can't get the output they need by pumping. And so they pump some milk and then they do some formula, or they nurse when they're home, but they give formula when they're away from the baby, or breastfeeding has never worked for them. And so they do formula, or they just decide that it doesn't, they are ready to switch to formula. Their kids are all beautiful. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it is something, it's just one of the many, many, many parenting choices that you have to make for yourself, and have confidence in the choices that you're making with you and your partner and your pediatrician and figuring out what's going to work for your family. But I think if you do decide that you want to pump and nurse while you're working, it's something else that you want to plan ahead for and learn some of these hacks, because there are ways to make it a little easier on yourself if you need to. And just, it's a journey. It's a journey. The milk will spill on your lap. I mean, and then you'll cry that you lost, because it's a game of ounces. You'll be like, that was an ounce. So no, I mean, it's all sorts of crazy stuff. So like many things, you do have to reach out and get the support that you need and get creative with your schedule. Because, I have something to go to after we finish this podcast, and I have to carve out my little 15 minutes of pump time before I can do that, because I won't get to pump until I've got a block of things afterwards. It changes how you see your day. And I'm lucky that I work for myself in an office that's alone. So I can just pump on the pump whenever I need to. It's, it's not that easy for everybody. And I respect that. So something else you just need to plan for.
Definitely.
All right. One of the other things I wanted us to talk about today was, I think about your village and childcare, which I think is a huge part of your village, because you can't go back to work unless somebody's going to be watching your baby, unless you can bring your baby to work. There are a lot of different options around childcare, more than I think a lot of people appreciate. There's having a nanny, which typically a nanny takes care of just your children. But there's something that's really popular where I live called nanny shares, where you and maybe one other family hire one nanny to watch a couple of kids, and they usually watch them at one person's house, and that cuts down the costs of the nanny share. Oftentimes family members will watch the kids for, if you have parents around, maybe one day a week or multiple days a week. You mentioned daycare. Wait lists can be really important for daycares, especially in metropolitan areas.
Right. And there's institutional daycares, right, at like a daycare center, or there's an in-home daycare, right? So there are options there too.
Yep. You need to have solutions for when your kids get sick, because let me tell you, when they go and out in the general population, they come back with all sorts of viruses. The viruses are real, the runny noses and the coughs and everything. And so you have to have a plan for what are you going to do when your kids get sick. If you're at a daycare, or sometimes a nanny share, if your kid's sick, they can't go. So then who's going to take care of that kid? I actually have this memory from my childhood, because my parents were both working parents, of me being sick and standing in the kitchen with my parents and my grandmother, who also lived near us, but they all worked. My grandmother was a legal secretary, and my parents were both lawyers, and they were all kind of on this adult level. So I'm sitting on the floor because I'm tiny, and then they're all debating on who's going to take care of me. And it was pretty much the negotiation of whose day could be imploded. For whatever had happened. I was sick or whatever. And so, my dad was a litigator. And so it was he had court for part of the day. And then my mom was okay, well, I could do that. And they had to piece together this whole situation to care for me, because I couldn't go to school. And that's a lot of stress on a family.
It can be really stressful, if both partners have a day where they need to be in the office and the baby's sick and someone needs to stay home. I've experienced it firsthand, and it can be really stressful. I think you need to anticipate that this is going to happen, at many points over the next few years, and try to have a plan in place beforehand as best you can, right? So, if my husband and I think one of our children is getting sick, the night before, we try to come up with a plan, right? Maybe you can take the morning and I can take the afternoon or something like that. Because if you wait until, 7 a.m. when you're trying to get out the door and you're trying to figure out who's going to do what, it can just add to the stress.
Yeah. Or the 2 a.m. puking is always my favorite.
Right.
When you're like, there goes my whole day.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about researching all different types of childcare, and this is something you can do as you're, deciding to start a family or while you're pregnant, is how much is this going to cost? Because childcare is not cheap. And it can be very expensive, and it's a stress on a family financial situation, especially if you still have law school loans that you're paying off. This is another kind of, weekly or monthly bill, and you have to be able to balance that. I think there've been some interesting articles recently about, moms negotiating the costs of childcare and whether or not, if childcare and their professional existence kind of cancel each other out. Is it worth it, quote unquote, worth from an economics perspective for the mom to stay home instead of working if the net result is pretty much a wash? They go to work and then, that basically pays for childcare. And one of the arguments is for women, when you remove yourself from the career path, that you have an opportunity cost that you're losing of future gains because you're losing those years. So that it's not really kind of a 1-for-1. If you want to continue to invest in your career, even if it's not, making a financial difference now, it might in the future. But it's very interesting and complicated from an economics perspective, from a personal perspective. If you want to take time off to be with your kids, I did not want to be a stay-at-home mom. I think I would be a crummy stay-at-home mom. That's not my skill set. I love my kids. I'm not a kid person. I just am not. Like, I see like childcare providers and people who do this, and I'm like, you're a kid person. Awesome. I am not.
Yeah, no, I'm so amazed and grateful for all those amazing childcare providers out there, because I'm not sure I could do what they do day in and day out.
Yeah. And my children are better for the childcare providers and educators that they have had. They have learned things from them that they would have never learned from me. And I think that those relationships have really helped them be the people they are today. And, as much as there's a lot of mama guilt, like in that stew of feelings, when you have to say goodbye to a kid that doesn't want you to leave, I do really cherish the fact that they have gained a lot from other people who love them, because I think kids can be loved by a whole village, and I think they're better off for it.
Yeah, I agree. It's as guilty as I feel most days for sending my children to daycare. I see them learning so much from, the diverse set of people that they're around. So that's kind of what I try to remind myself of when I'm having one of those really hard days.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely the days where you're just like, oh my gosh, you're crying in the car. I mean, when my son had a tough time going to preschool, like he was very sad about going to school. And I mean, I would just like sit in my car and cry after I dropped him off for like 5 minutes because, I didn't want him to see it. But it was hard for me. But then I would be like, I know this is something that we need to do, and I know he's going to love it. And we got through it, but it's really hard, and then I had to say, okay, that was my moment to be emotional about this. And then it was time to put myself back together and start my day, because I had other responsibilities. I think one of the other things that's interesting when you think about parenthood is I think a lot of people talk about the stress around when your children are very young. But as this group of lawyer moms reminded me, this juggle continues really throughout adolescence as well. I mean, teenagers have individual needs that you need to meet, and other young kids. I mean, it's always going to be a juggle. You might be juggling different things, but there's always going to be a juggle.
So it doesn't really end, is what you're telling me.
That's what they tell me. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay.
Well, maybe in 5 more years we can do another podcast and be like, let's talk about having elementary school kids. I think one thing though that we have to remember is that, and this is spoken as the daughter of a law mama, but I think lawyers make great mamas. And I'm the kid of two lawyers. So try winning an argument in my house. But, I think lawyer moms, we know how to learn new things. I think one of the things Alison and I always talk about law school is that law school taught us to be really great students because, you're constantly learning. And then when you practice law, you're constantly learning as well. And you have to learn a lot about being a parent. And you got to problem solve. Because lawyers are really good at problem solving. And you have to manage a lot of crises. And I think lawyers are trained to manage that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of lawyers are perfectionists.
Yeah.
And so from that perspective, it can be sort of challenging to be a parent because when you have, children, things oftentimes, can't be perfect. You kind of just have to do the best that you can do.
Yeah.
And that's just something that you kind of have to get used to and get comfortable with.
Yeah. And let me tell you, no one negotiates like a preschooler. Wow. My kid has a solution for everything. It's like, well, what about this, mama? I'm like, yeah, so you have to use all your negotiating skills with your small children.
Yeah.
Be on your game. And then we've mentioned it before, but mama guilt is real. And I think it's something that you really have to figure out how you're going to make peace with and negotiate for yourself. If you're really struggling, I think therapy is a great option of self-care. You do have to take care of yourself, helping people problem solve for you about what you want this balance to look like. Especially sometimes you might want to, change career paths or work with a coach to come up with a new option to make the life that you want. But you should reach out for help because you don't have to solve all these problems by yourself.
Yeah, and you don't have to, try to cultivate this life just to keep up with what other people are doing, what other people are doing, right? You just need to figure out what is going to work best for you and your family and make you and your family the happiest. And, maybe that's working full time, maybe it's part time, maybe it's staying at home. It's just such an individual decision.
It really is. And you might even want to try it, try going back to work, see if you like it. Some people go back and are like, I just don't want to do this. And then that tells them, gives them that answer. Some people are home all day and are like, this isn't really working for me either. And so they look for, job opportunities that are going to allow them to have that balance. I know amazing stay-at-home moms who are taking time away from being lawyers. But I know for me, I'm a better mom when I'm with my kids if I have my own life separate from them. And that doesn't mean that I don't love them. It just means that that's how I'm a better mom. And so, yeah, I'm the mom doing the happy dance in the street when the kids go back to school. But I'm better when I have that perspective. And then I really can drop in and cherish the time, that we do have together, which I think is very important. So I can be more present with them when I'm not, when I get my time away.
And I think, the legal world is a really difficult place to be a parent for both men and women, right? Being a lawyer is such a demanding, stressful job, and there are so many hours that lawyers work. So I think it's a really hard industry to be in if you're going to be a parent. But it seems like sort of very slowly the legal culture is changing, and we're seeing more firms offering, reduced hour options or work from home options and things like that. So hopefully, that will continue to kind of permeate throughout the law and just make it easier for moms and dads to continue to work as lawyers if that's what they want to do.
Yeah. And we've got to get creative. When I was pregnant with my son, Alison and I were at a legal conference, and a man, asked me when I told Alison I was pregnant and how long I waited to tell her. And I was like, she was the second person I told after my family that I was pregnant. And there was this look of shock. And I was like, well, it has business ramifications for us. Not only is she a dear friend, but we have to have a business. And they were like, well, what's your business going to do? And we were like, if two women can't figure out how to keep a business running when one of us has a kid, then we're all in big trouble.
Yeah, then it's hopeless.
And, I think it's not always easy. It takes different people, picking up the slack and creative solutions. But, we are smart problem solving women, and we do have the power to start shaping and making suggestions on how to make this better. And I hope that the future generations of women are going to have more choices than a lot of women do right now in how they want to become new moms. But I think I think it's kind of one of our jobs is to talk about it and share what's worked and share what hasn't, so we can all continue to make this better for all of us, because it makes us better lawyers, it makes us better moms, and it's good for our kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, we're out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you won't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk soon, and we will link to some helpful resources if you'd like to read more on this topic. And stay tuned for future podcasts where we'll talk more about the realities of parenthood and being a mom in the legal profession. Thanks so much.